Friends, when I was a kid, some of the treasures that I held dearly to my heart, one was the piggy bank. I had all my coins there. It was an earthen container, looked like a peg, and so I really treasured it. Every morning I got up after my prayer, I would make sure it's in the right place. Every afternoon when I got back from school, I'd make sure it's there, right? So that was the one treasure I had. The other one was the snow globe, snow globe with the nativity scene inside it. I was fascinated to see all that glitter inside. So that attracted a 10-year-old, right? So I would play with it and keep it as my two treasures next to my rosary and the Bible that my parents gave me. But as a kid, those were more important to me than Bible and rosary. But I wish my brother Paul came to confession today, because he's the one who would take it and hide it, and I would have nightmares that I lost it, or it got broken, or someone took it away, my treasure, right? But he has not done that yet. Hopefully someday. I'm sure he goes to confession, but not to Maxy. So the central theme of today's scriptures is the necessity for trusting faith in God's promises and vigilant preparedness among Christ's faithful to meet their God as their judge and rewarder at the time of their death. Fidelity in doing God's will is the best preparation for our death. I'll say it again. Fidelity in doing God's will is the best preparation for our death to meet our God as followers, as disciples. How many of you read the life saints? You don't have to raise your hands now, but I love to read the saints, and they inspire me so much. Yesterday we had the feast of St. Lawrence. I know many of you have Larry or Lawrence as your names. And today is St. Clare of Assisi, Mother Clare for the Franciscans. She was devoted to the Eucharist. When the enemies came, she had the monstrance out, and, the enemies went away. So Lawrence was a young deacon in the middle of the 3rd century, born in Spain, and then went to Rome, and Pope Sixtus II appointed him as the treasurer of the Archdiocese in Vatican. So he was there looking after the treasures of the church. So the monstrances that were gold, the aspergillium, the cups, the ciborias, all what we use in the church is liturgies. And Emperor Valerian, who was persecuting the church, had declared an edict that the Pope and the bishops and the priests and the deacons were to be put to death. But he wanted to have a conversation with Lawrence, because Lawrence held the treasures of the church, and he wanted part of the treasures for himself so that he could invest the wealth into his military and have a strong military to fight his enemies. So Pope Sixtus II was put to death on August 6th, and so now he has a conversation with Lawrence, and Lawrence asks him to give him some time so that he can collect the treasures and keep it ready for him. So Lawrence, takes all the treasures and he sells them and makes money, and then he calls all the poor from around Italy and distributes the wealth to all these poor people. And then on a certain day, he invites the emperor or his delegate to come and collect the wealth. So when the emperor comes, Valerian, Lawrence invites these poor people on this certain day. And when Emperor Valerian comes, Lawrence says to Valerian, here's the treasure of the church, the poor, the widows, the orphans. You can have them. When Valerian was so mad with him that he had a gridiron and he burnt him alive on this gridiron. And when Lawrence was being burnt one side like steak, he said, "I'm done, turn me the other way around." That's how much he was burning with love for the Lord, because the Lord was his treasure. His bodily pain didn't mean much to him, because his eyes were set on heaven as his goal. That was his treasure. That's what he was looking forward to. What a life. What a dedication. And the second part is the almsgiving to the poor, that he offered everything of the church's treasures to the poor, because that's the wealth. The church is you, all of us. And our treasure has to be heaven. Nothing else but heaven has to be our treasure. So friends, you were probably hoping that Father would take the shorter version of the gospel, or maybe not. But the reason I read the longer version is because I'm going to just directly focus on the last parable that Jesus talks about in today's gospel. He talks about the four stewards, right? One is a faithful steward who does all what is right and good to his master. He is a faithful steward. He takes care of his master's wealth, distributes it in the right manner with the other servants. So he's called the faithful servant, right? And the master gives him the whole of his property to be in charge, to manage, because he's a responsible man. He's a faithful man. He's an honest man. He's a trustworthy man. The second is a man who says, "Well, Master is long delayed. What am I doing now? Let's drink, have parties, be drunk, abuse his power," right? The manservants, the maidservants are beaten, and he's having a great time. But this man, when the master arrives, he punishes him. You know, the other versions of the Gospels say that he was cut in two. And, you know, in antiquity, when you're cut in two, we have medical progress today, you remain cut in two, right? So he was, in Gehenna. The third one is one who knows his master's will, but yet does not do it. But he doesn't beat up his other maid servants or manservants, but he just doesn't do what he's supposed to be doing, probably a procrastinator. And then when time comes, he's caught up and is wondering, "Oh man, I didn't do nothing." So he gets a severe punishment, but he's not thrown with the unfaithful, you see. He has to receive punishment for his actions. There is consequence to our actions. We talk about it all the time with our children and family members. Just so it happens with the third man. How about the fourth man? The fourth guy has no idea about his master's will, right? No idea about what his master is asking him to do. I don't know why he doesn't have the idea, but he has no idea. And so his responsibility toward his action diminishes. And so that's why what happens to him, he gets a lighter punishment. Invincibly ignorant is what the moral theologians would call this fourth guy, because his culpability, his responsibility diminishes because of the lack of knowledge he had. So he gets lighter beating, and it's there, right? So we have these four people. Now, in modern day readings, we would think, "Oh, well, that is outrageous. Servants, abuse, slaves." But Jesus was trying to use this image that was prevalent in his time, that people could understand, to the image that they wouldn't understand, the heavenly image of God as our author, our judge, our Lord and Master, who would take an account of our lives. So the first one, we know, does well, receives the reward. He enters the kingdom of heaven. The second is unfaithful, abuses his power, knowingly, willingly, mortal sin, right, goes into the fires of hell, Gehenna. What about the third and the fourth? Well, I'll let you figure that out, right? Okay, so the third one and the fourth one reminds us, obviously, gives us an image of the eschatological judgment, beating that is temporary, not permanent. Because the second servant has the permanent punishment among the unfaithful. Third one, severe beating. Fourth one, light beating, knowingly and then unknowingly, we talked about. But beating means temporal, finite. This image will go to lay the foundation in Jesus' own teaching for the later church doctrines that come to be known as purgatory. Now, many of us don't feel too excited about it, but that's what Jesus is teaching us about. The purgatory is the teaching that the church has understood from Jesus' second parable today. The idea that after death, at our judgment, there are some people whose sins will not be so grave as to put them into the fires of hell, nor the actions so great as to lead them into the heavenly kingdom. So what happens with these people, right? So the church says, well, there is a time of purification for them. They need to, pay for the actions, be purified. And while the church will use the word purgatory, and that's the teaching of the church, that these people will spend their time and experience temporal punishment for their sins, venial sins. And venial sins, we cannot mess up with venial sins either. Sometimes in our Christian tradition and habits, we think, well, venial sins are fine. We get them washed away anyway. Well, when they pile up, what happens? They can bury us down, right? So deliberate venial sin is not something to play around with. That's why, the severe punishment in purgatory or the time of purification, whatever that place you might want to call, but the church says it's purgatory. So then the venial sins are to be purified, and both these servants, after their purification, will enter the time, the reward, the eternal kingdom. So you might wonder, where is the doctrine of purgatory, Father Maxy? Well, you can see it in the Old Testament, book of Maccabees. Maccabees 2:12 talks about these men praying for those that were dead. 1 Corinthians 3 talks about the fires for purification. And how about Jesus himself in today's gospel, talking about the third and the fourth person? If it was written later on, some, Christian traditions of the scriptures, they would have left this out, right? But it is from the start. From the start when these scriptures were written, what Jesus was teaching, and that's the truth of our faith today. So friends, how do we deal with our preparation is the key. What are our treasures? What do we hold on to? How are we going to prepare ourselves? Because there is death, judgment, heaven, hell, and also time purification, purgatory. Those are the elements we have to focus our eyes on, because someday, life is short, someday we have to encounter this reality. And how are we going to prepare ourselves is what Jesus is asking us. So one way to prepare ourselves to be vigilant servants, to have that trusting faith and being faithful followers of Christ, disciples, because this teaching is for the disciples and we are the disciples. One way is that intimate time of prayer with Jesus, with God. And in that prayer time, we will understand as we see God in our faith, as the book of Hebrews talks to us, defines what faith is, we will understand God's will. We will know God's plan. And that's the best way to prepare ourselves. And in that way, we will act accordingly. reaching out to the poor, giving alms to the needy, and helping the needs of the church as good stewards through our time, talent, and resources? Are we willing to take that leap of faith today and prepare ourselves so that we will be counted among that first servant who was faithful and true to his master's instructions, to his master's commandments? The church gives us its teachings. There is no selective decisions that we can make. We have to embrace all the teachings of the church. And in that way, we have to remain faithful to the church in our day-to-day life today. So I pray that you will respond in faith and prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, the Holy Spirit.